Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning. Welcome to the week 3 of this ongoing online course on understanding and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and we are specifically looking at scope 1 and scope 2 of emission reduction and largely through building design and construction. So, this is the second lecture of week 3, and here we are going to talk about ISO international standards focusing on greenhouse gases. So, we are not going to look at all the environmental standards in today's lecture, but focusing only on the standard ISO standard which focuses on greenhouse gases. I am your instructor, Professor Avlokita Agrawal. I am an associate professor in Department of Architecture and Planning at IIT Roorkee. So, quickly taking you through what we discussed yesterday, we actually talked about greenhouse gas protocol, what are the different parts of the protocol, different standards within the protocol, what do they cover, and what all are they talking about the greenhouse gas accounting. So, that is all covered in greenhouse gas protocol, and if you remember towards the end of yesterday's lecture, I had discussed with you about different other standards and initiatives which are actually based upon greenhouse gas protocol, and one of them was this ISO 14064, which is actually the ISO standard talking about greenhouse gases. So, in today's lecture we are largely going to focus on ISO 14064, which is kind of a complementary code, complementary standard to the greenhouse gas protocol, which is what we will see later. But greenhouse gas protocol covers some parts of this greenhouse gas emissions reporting accounting mechanism, and a lot of parts are also covered by ISO 14064. So, this is a standard and GHG protocol is a protocol. So, this is the difference that we have to understand and watch what each one of these cover and how do they complement each other towards greenhouse gas accounting. So, the ultimate objective is greenhouse gas accounting only. That is what we are going to look at in ISO 14064. But before that, we will quickly go through how 14064 came into existence, and this entire series with the number 14000. So, this is the series of standards of ISO which deal with the environmental issues is what we are quickly going to start with. So, let us begin our lecture today with a quick introduction of ISO. So, ISO or International Organization for Standardization, it is an international non-governmental organization made up of national standard bodies that develop and publish a wide range of proprietary, industrial and commercial standards. So, ISO is the international standardization body which is actually made up of different national standardization bodies, and they all come together and they develop and publish a wide range of these standards, 14,000 series being one of those, and it was actually founded in 1947 and it is headquartered at Geneva, Switzerland. So, in addition to producing the standards, ISO also comes up with reports from time to time and publicly available specifications, technical core agenda and guides. So, they do not just publish standards, but a whole lot of series on technical matters is what they publish. ISO as an organization has been instrumental and it plays a vital role in facilitating the world trade by providing common standards among different countries. Now, when I say that, for example, the goods produced in one country, they have to be sold in another country. How do we ensure that there is quality, there is minimum standard quality? So, for that the standards, and that is where we had written. So, it publishes a wide range of proprietary, industrial and commercial standards. So, for example, fabric, for example, denim as a fabric is produced in one country and used by another country. What is the quality of this denim fabric? What are the tests and methods used to determine that this is an A grade quality or a B grade or a C grade quality? even those standards are developed and published by ISO, which help a fair trade. So, we have to ensure the quality of the product and also that this quality of a product deserves this much price in international market is what is determined through these standards. So, that is what ISO does too, and it literally covers all the fields from healthcare to, just as I gave you the example of fabric as a product, of anything as a product, toys, phones, everything. So, from technology to manufacturing, in all the fields is covered under the standards, and not just these, security, environment, everything is covered by ISO. So, it is a dynamic, diverse organization which has very wide length and breadth. Now, if we look at the structure and how ISO is governed, so we actually have few committees and advisory groups, which is what you are seeing here. So, we have a president's committee, we will quickly come to what each one of this does. Then we have standing committees, council committees, the advisory groups and policy development committees. Now, all these 4 different types of committees, they facilitate General Assembly, which is the supreme. So, General Assembly is the supreme, and council and central secretariat, they are within the General Assembly, smaller bodies consisting of some members. General Assembly is a body which consists of all the members which are party to ISO. So, almost all the nations have their own standardization bodies, and these standardization bodies have representatives in the General Assembly, they are part of ISO. Of course, this is a voluntary participation, voluntary membership. So, if somebody wants to be, some country wants to be a part of ISO, they will. If they do not want to be part of ISO, they may not. But then General Assembly comprises of all the members, and the major decisions and the approvals are happening through General Assembly is what we understand. Then we also have technical committees which will contribute, which will support the councils. Now, we will see what each one of these does. So, as I said, General Assembly is the overarching organ and the ultimate authority of the organization, which majority of the organizations we have seen, United Nations, the General Assembly is the biggest organization with biggest organ. So, there an annual general body meeting is held, and it is attended by all their members and principal officers. Then ISO council, this is the council that we are talking about here. So, it is the core governance body. So, which is what we normally know in other organizations as the executive body, which executes, it is the governing body of the organization, and it reports to the General Assembly. It meets over 3 times in an year, and it comprises of few members. So, some 20 member bodies and the ISO officers and the chairs of different policy development committees. So, we have these policy development committees, which are the chairs of these policy development committees are also part of the ISO council. If we look at the president's committee, it advises council on matters which are decided by the council. The council standing committee, so if we look at here, there are 4 council standing committees. We have finance standing committee, we have a strategy and policy, nominations for governance position. So, there is a committee for that, and there is an overall governance practices, organizations governance practices standing committee. So, the members are on rotation here, some will have permanent seats, but some will be rotating, and these committees will be reconstituted every few years. Then we also have advisory groups to provide advices on specific matters to ISO's commercial policy and information technology. So, these advisory groups, they bring in experts who will advise them on specific matters related to different policies and others. Then we have these policy development committees. So, one is this CASCO, which provides guidance on conformity assessment. So, how to conform to certain standards. So, that conformity assessment is done by this CASCO. Then we have COPOLCO, which provides guidance on consumer issues. So, there are consumer issues. So, we have to clearly keep in mind that ISO does not just give standards on specific technical subjects, but it covers wide range of commercial matters also, and it is largely responsible for enabling the fair trade in the world. So, they provide guidance on consumer issues, and DevCo provides guidance on matters related to developing countries. So, ISO specifically has a standing committee which guides on matters related to developing countries. So, whenever a standard or a framework is being developed in ISO, these standing committees, they provide advisory and guidance specifically on these issues: developing countries, consumer issues and conformity assessment. The membership of the council is open. Whoever wants to be a member can be a member, they can become representative of a member community. And then there is also a technical management board, so which is reporting to the council, which is what we have seen here. So, the technical committees, they support the technical board and then which supports the council. So, this is what the overall structure of ISO as an organization is, and together they come up with different standards. Now, coming to ISO 14000 standard series. So, 14000 series defines the series of international environmental management standards. So, this number, when you see ISO 14000, and it could be 14001, 2, 3, whatever, and we will ultimately be talking about 14064. So, they are, all these standards are relating to environmental management standards, guides and technical reports. So, when we say 14064, we are actually looking at greenhouse gases, which is again one of the issues within the larger umbrella of environmental management. So, several codes are developed as part of 14000 series. Quickly looking at a timeline, there is, for the first time, there is the success of ISO 9000, and which has led to the work, starting the work on 14000 series, the environmental management series. And from then on, 1996, the first version of ISO 14000 standards published, and then revisions, major revision happened in 2004, and then another set is published in 2015, that is the same year when Paris Agreement happened. And then there are no new certifications, but there are just few additions. And finally, in 2018, companies certified to ISO 14001 are required to upgrade to 14001 2015 version. So, there is no new addition, but the upgraded versions are available. This is from 92 to 2018, and then we also have 14064 coming up. If we look at the evolution of 14000 series, there are a lot of parties. So, UNCED, if you look at this, the UNCED 1992, which is also known as Earth Summit. So, that was a party and also responsible significantly towards development of ISO 14000. There are other committees, for example, British Standards and British Standards Institute. So, they are responsible for contributing and developing ISO 14000. There is European Union, which has also contributed towards development of ISO 14000. We have International Electrotechnical Commission. We also have the Chemical Industries Association, Safety, Health and Management Systems. So, a lot of these organizations came together, and the technical committees of ISO as an organization was already existing, and the technical committees of different codes within ISO, they came together to develop ISO 14000. This is how ISO 14000 developed, through contributions from different existing ISOs. So, here we are talking about ISO 9001, ISO Technical Committee of 207, 176, UNCED, European Union, British Standards, all of them contributing to development of ISO 14000 series. We are talking about ISO 14001 for the first time, and then we will move on to ISO 14064. Usually, the larger concept of ISO 14000 family is Plan, Do, Study, Act, or which is actually the variant of Plan, Do, Check, Act. So, it is a cyclic process, and they keep improving, and because it is environmental management series, and the environment is not static, it has a dynamic behavior. It continues to change. The policies or the actions that have been that are being taken in the world and what is the impact of that, taking that into cognizance. It is an ever evolving series. So, we will find versions of that. Unlike many other standards which are static, this one is dynamic in nature, and every few years there will be a study carried out on how it is performing, and then the revisions will happen. So, plan, do, study and act is the principle that it is based upon. Now, of this 14,000 series, there are several standards: 14,004, 6, 15, 20, 31, 40, 50, 63, finally coming to 64. So, there are many other standards within this 14,000 series, but these are the most notable one. And what we are looking at here particularly is this particular standard, which is relating to greenhouse gas protocol, is the standard on greenhouse gases. This is what we are taking forward, but there are other standards. For example, this 14040, which is talking about life cycle assessment. We have a standard only on vocabulary of the words which are used in environmental management related issues. We also have standards which are serving as guidelines for incorporating eco design, ecological design. We have for assessment of sites and organizations and a lot of others, but we are going ahead with this 14064. So, let us quickly understand the structure and description of this 1404064. So, this has three standard parts. Part 1 deals with the guidance at the organization level for quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. Part 2, it is the specification for quantification and monitoring and reporting of project emissions and removals, and part 3 is the specification with guidance for the validation and verification. So, we are looking at the quantification and reporting of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. Second, we are looking at monitoring, we are adding the monitoring part, and in the third one we are talking about validation and verification of greenhouse gas assertions here. So, these are the three standard parts of 14064, which is dealing with greenhouse gases. If we look at the development of 14064, we have seen all the different parties, but we have to clearly understand that the greenhouse gas protocol corporate module or the corporate standard was used as the primary seed document to ISO 14064 part 1, which is actually dealing with inventories. So, when we are talking about the quantification and reporting, we are actually talking about the inventories here. So, the inventories were taken from the GHG protocol, the corporate standard, and that served as a seed document. Now, more and more inventories are also being developed as part of 14064 part 1. And gradually, as we are moving forward, GHG protocol and ISO 14064 are working complementary to each other. They are not contradicting or contrasting each other's scope of work. They have very clearly defined scope of works and are complementing each other. So, initially when this ISO 14064 was being created, the staff of WRI and WBCSD, which were responsible for creating GHG protocol. So, WRI and WBCSD, they only created GHG protocol. So, the staff of the same organizations along with the GHGP revision working group members, they contributed to the development of 14064, the early versions, and from there on 14064 continued to grow and have its own inventories, bigger inventories, but the parent document and the confirmation to GHG protocol continues. So, now when it is maturing more and more today, so in the next lecture what we will see is this, that ISO 14064 is considered as the what to do. So, what all needs to be done if we want to report, measure, monitor the GHG emissions, and GHG protocol is considered as how to really do it. So, what do we want to do? Inventories, organizational boundaries and all that, what do we want to measure, monitor, and then how to really do it. And simultaneously, we are also talking about within these two how to reduce these emissions. We are not talking about projects which are offsetting, which are specifically developed for removing the GHG emissions, but here we are talking about the what to do and how to do it. The protocol of reporting accounting is what we are looking at. So, if you look at the ISO 14064, which is, and look at the broader framework. So, we have this part 1, which is design and develop organizational GHG inventories. So, part 1 of 14064 talks about design and development of organizational GHG inventories. So, we are largely talking about inventory documentation and reports as part 1 of ISO 14064, and in part 2 we are talking about the documentation and reports. So, first part has inventories and the second part has project reports, documentation reports of the project, and together they will be giving us a verification of the GHG assertion. So, part 3 is actually talking about the process of verification. So, one is inventory, 2 is project documentation for the inventory, bringing both of them together, and third part is verification of the process. So, whether the inventories have been understood and selected correctly, whether the data collection, the documentation part has been done correctly for the inventories. So, the third part is verification, which is important. So, validation and verification is dealt in part 3 of ISO 14064. All these three together give us a proper verified, monitored measurement of the GHG emissions as a framework we are talking about. Now, in addition to this 14064, 14065 helps us in defining the specifications for validation and verification bodies. Who will verify? So, the organization which is reporting the emissions will not verify. So, there is a third party, there is a body which will validate and verify the emissions. So, these are the specifications. 14065 is the specification for this verification and validation body. Not everybody can validate. Who will validate? How will they validate? How will they verify? So, these specifications are given in 14065. Together, this is the broad framework of how 14064 standard will work. So, this is quickly going through what it applies to. 14064 part 1 will apply to the entire organizational report. It will help in identifying the assets, individual assets or selected groups, specific projects, and here we will identify what all inventories will be required to measure and monitor. The 14064 part 2 will be applied to the reduction projects or the removal projects. So, we are actually measuring the numbers there, and part 3 is for verification and validation is what we have seen. So, organizational GHG statement, project GHG statement, all of that will there 14064 part 3 will be applied. If we have to see the steps how to go about part 1, the first part is to identify the specific emission sources. Whenever we are looking at a company, an organization, an activity as a set of activities, a group of activities, the first thing is to identify these specific emission sources. So, in an academic institute, what are the emissions, what could be the possible emission sources? For example, transportation. So, what all vehicles are coming in? Then we also have, for example, in the hostels, in the messes, the cooking is happening. So, what kind of fuel is happening? So, we have to identify the specific emission sources within the operational boundaries. So, we have to identify these emission sources within the specific operational boundaries, and then we have to identify, select a methodology for quantification of emissions. How will the emissions be quantified? We have to select that methodology which shall be applicable to the sources which have been identified. Different sources will have different methodology for calculation of emissions. So, we have to only identify the methodology as part 1, identify the sources and the methodology which will be used to quantify the emissions. That is step 1. Step 2, then we start collecting the data. So, for example, how many cars are owned by the campus population, how many scooters are there, if there are bicycles, how many bicycles are there. So, we will calculate these specific numbers. So, this is data. if we have to calculate how much emission is resulting from this particular activity, which is actually one of the emission sources. So, this is the data that we are talking about, and this is within this operational boundary that we are considering. And then we will also identify the established emission factors. For example, this academic institute, the campus, will consume a lot of electricity for various purposes, lighting, heating, ventilation, for comfort creation. So, this is what the electricity is going, and also for equipments and tools, a lot of these things. Now, we might be able to calculate the exact number because it is metered, electricity is a metered thing. So, we will then need to know the emission factor for the electricity that is reaching here. So, it is not causing direct emissions on the campus, but it is causing emissions somewhere else. So, what is the emission factor? Depends upon how this electricity is being produced. In Uttarakhand as a state, we know that a larger share of this electricity is coming through hydropower, while in states, some other states, the larger share of electricity might be coming from coal. It might vary state wise, but for a nation, then we would also know that what is the national emission factor for electricity or other things too. That depends upon what is the percentage of electricity coming from different types of fuel. So, just to give you an idea that in India, still the majority of electricity is coming from coal as a source. So, the emission factor, if we average it over the entire country, so leaving aside some states such as Uttarakhand, where the larger share of electricity is coming from hydropower, if we average it out for the nation, the electricity still has a high emission factor, because large part of the electricity is still being produced from coal. It is the same story with America, they have a higher emission factor than India. If you look at Spain, they have a very low emission factor because a large part of their electricity is actually coming from renewables, solar power majorly. So, it will vary from country to country. So, this is what we have to know, what is the emission factor, established emission factor for different activities, for different sources of energy. This is the second step. So, collecting the data and also knowing the emission factor. So, we would know petrol, how much is the emission factor for petrol, how much is the emission factor for diesel. These numbers are established usually, and we would know that. The third step is the data and the emission factors, they have to be applied consistently with the quantification methodology, which we have identified in the first step. So, first step we identified the methodology and the activities, second step we collected the data and the emission factor, and in the third step we will substitute this data and emission factor into the methodology that was identified, and in the final steps we quantify the emissions for each source. So, and then we will put all of them together, is how the part 1 of ISO 14064 talks about. So, it has several sections and subsections discussing the GHG inventory issues for organizations, and it establishes a process, which is what this particular process is, to quantify GHG emission for the inventory. So, different inventories and how to quantify GHG emissions is what it talks about. So, then we are talking about largely the inventory design and development, the quality management of the inventory, and also the components. So, when we come to components, the first two parts we have majorly covered, but yeah, one thing which we need to see here is setting of boundaries. Where is the boundary of my organization? For example, I was taking this example of a campus. So, the campus has its physical boundary, okay, but a lot of services are actually coming into it. For example, hostels, messes. Now, a lot of food product is coming into the campus like this. So, there are these grains and vegetables. Now, how are they coming in? How are they being produced? We have to define the boundary, whether we are taking that into account or not is definition of this boundary, and that will depend upon. So, we will come to that, how to define the organizational boundary, and there is standard mechanism, standard framework for defining what is the organizational boundary or what is the operational boundary. How much of these emissions that are resulting from certain activities will be accounted for, will be counted in the emissions resulting from this particular company, this particular organization. So, this is a critical part, defining boundaries, and it has to be done right in the beginning. This depends upon how much shareholding, equity holding we have in a particular activity. So, we will come to this in the next lecture, the third lecture of this week. And then we go ahead with the quantification, the data collection, the documentation, transparent documentation, and then we talk about the inventory components, where we talk about the emissions, where all the emissions are happening, and reduction of emissions within that, and we also talk about the removals. Now, if you remember distinctly, we had GHG protocol where under certain standards, for example, corporate standards and the mitigation goal standards, we were not talking about the removal projects, the sequestration projects, but here as part of 14064, when we are talking about the organization as well as the inventory, we are looking at the removals also. So, not just reduction of emissions, but also the removals within the organization and the operations. And then we are talking about the reporting, the GHG reporting. So, we have the report planning, the principles of GHG protocol which we had discussed yesterday about transparency, about the completeness. So, they all remain as an integral part of 140642. So, here we are talking about the planning of the report, what all goes into the report, the contents of it, the formatting of it, and how the dissemination, the report that is going to be disseminated will be verified. So, these are the parts of ISO 14064 part 1. In part 2, we are actually talking about the projects. So, inventory, and then we are talking about the projects here. So, we are this particular standard 14064 part 2, it deals with what all goes into these projects. So, we are talking about starting with general requirements and describing the projects. We start with identifying GHG sources, sinks and reservoirs for the project. So, specifically identify them, determine the baseline scenario, identify the GHG sources, sinks and reservoirs for the baseline scenario. So, we have already identified the sources, sinks and reservoirs for the overall project, but for the baseline scenario, what are the sources, sinks and reservoirs, and then we select these sources, sinks and reservoirs for regular monitoring and quantification. So, whenever a project is going to be undertaken, so we are going to be assessing and monitoring it for a continuous period. So, every year or every few years there will be reporting, and what we have already identified as a baseline scenario and what we have already identified as a source or sink for the project will continue to be monitored for this entire duration. For these, we will quantify the greenhouse gases. We can add some more parts, but we will usually not delete, because if some activity which was earlier an emitter or a source of emissions is the emissions are reducing there. So, there the activity continues to be there, but with zero emissions is what we are understanding, but we do not remove a certain part. We continue to have it if we have had that in the baseline scenario. For example, as a company, as an IT company, I was giving you this example yesterday, if I have a fleet to bring people to the office, and that fleet was for example say running on diesel earlier, fleet of buses, and then I totally shift to electric buses, entirely shifting to electric buses. Now, there I cannot remove this head of transportation and diesel based buses. It will just change, the emissions will reduce, or probably some other activity where it will come down to absolute zero. There could be some activity, but we will not remove that. The next step would be, and which we have to have in the project, is managing the data quality. So, how are we monitoring it? So, monitoring and verifying this measurement and verification protocol, there is a proper protocol, we have to follow that. How do we measure? So, we have to have metering for different quantities, for different aspects, for example, electricity. So, we have to have metering of electricity, metering of water for some other cases, but here since we are concerned only with GHG protocol, so we have to know exactly where the energy is going. Why we also need to know the different sources? is because we should also know the potential where the resources can be saved or the emissions can be reduced. For example, HVAC conditioning, a lot of energy goes into conditioning. We have to know specifically how much is going in lighting, artificial lighting of the place, and how much is going in the air conditioning. If I know that artificial lighting is consuming a lot of energy, maybe I will specifically look at the design issues or the change of material to bring in some daylight and reducing my consumption of artificial lighting, energy for artificial lighting. If it is just a total number, I may not be specifically knowing where the energy is getting consumed. So, it is not direct emission, but indirect emissions too, I have to know these specific points. So, this is what we are talking about, managing the data and its quality also. So, how do we measure? How do we monitor? So, having standard ways of measuring is what will be covered here. And then we monitor the GHG project. We monitor it for a period of time, document the project, and then we verify and validate. Again, this particular framework talks about how to validate and verify. So, not in part 2, but in part 3 we are specifically talking about validation and verification mechanisms. How will we verify and validate, and that has to be reported here, because this is where we are actually reporting the project, the entire project. And finally, reporting the GHG project if the company decides to disclose the emissions. Part 3, as I said, is about validation and verification, which is an important part. So, we have to establish the common principles, the ethical conduct, and then go about the validation and verification process. So, whether the third party has to come in. So, if you look at green buildings, so there how much energy has been reduced, the company is not authorized to say, it can only share the data, and some third party verifier will come into picture and say that okay, this much energy has been saved, or actually this much reduction has happened. So, there is a proper methodology, the level of assurance based upon the data that is being provided, the data, how the data is being procured is all part of this verification and validation process. There are other ISO standards on greenhouse gases too. So, we have 14067, which is for quantifying a product's carbon footprint. We have 14068, which is under development, but that will have guidance on carbon neutrality. So, a lot of countries, cities, states are actually aiming at carbon neutrality, becoming carbon neutral or net zero emission in certain decades to come. So, this will guide on how to go about this. 14069 has guidance for applying 14064. So, how to apply 14064? This is a standard which helps us on that. Now, all these are linked. If we look at them, 14064, it helps in preparing the GHG inventory and the report, and it will lead us to GHG statement. If we look at 14064 part 2, which is helping documenting the projects and reports, GHG projects and reports, it will again give us a GHG statement. If we look at 14061, we just looked at 14061, which is helping quantify the product's carbon footprint. There also we will come to GHG statement. So, all these are interrelated, interlinked. So, sometimes we will use them together in while reporting GHG emissions. So, these are very much linked, 14060 family. So, within 14000 family, we have this 14060 family, and a lot of these are interrelated. 14063, here we are talking about verification and validation. This is again bringing us to validating the GHG statement here, verifying the GHG statement, and 14065 and 66 are talking about the verification and validation. So, why at all should we be going ahead with 14064? Similar to GHG protocol, we have the underlying benefits as reducing the GHG emissions, and we are going by the principle that anything that is measured is valued, and if we have to reduce emissions, we have to first measure it, and the measurement itself is an indicator that we are valuing it. The more we value and measure, the more likely we are to reduce or increase whatever the task at hand is. In this case, the better our measurement and validation verification is, the greater will be the reduction potential. So, what we are actually looking at is, besides that fundamental that basic aim of reducing GHG emissions, we are actually looking at standardizing this entire framework and methodology of measuring and verifying the emissions. And how that helps? It helps businesses to compete and compare towards becoming better. So, we are actually becoming better in doing businesses with lesser emissions. So, we have better stakeholder relationships, there is more transparency. So, the business credentials will be improved. Then we also have legal compliance, because there are these standards in place. So, one company claiming that I have reduced emissions more will actually be legally complied if the standards and frameworks are followed, and of course, we will have greater customer satisfaction. Overall, what it helps, how it helps organizations? It helps organizations to understand their own greenhouse gas emissions, where the emissions are resulting, how can we reduce the emissions. So, if the organizations have good intents and they follow 14064, they will be actually able to locate where the emissions are happening within their organizations and operations, and they will be able to address it specifically, and they will also be able to prepare a verifiable and credible GHG emissions report. So, they will be able to improve gradually. Overall, it will help in reducing reporting, measuring, verifying, reporting GHG emissions, and eventually reducing them. And this will be a trusted report, is what we are ensuring through 14064 and GHG protocol. So, the report that is going to be produced, the reporting that is going to be done is a verified number, it is a validated number, is what these protocols and standards achieve. Strategically, we are actually looking at the voluntary application of this 14064, which will help in reducing the greenhouse gas emissions even when there is a lack of government policies. So, as an international standard, even when the individual national or subnational governments have not been able to frame policies, this standard is going to help the organizations, smaller organizations, to voluntarily apply this particular code and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and also to report. Operationally, we will see it will help them in improving the public relations, in managing the risks and creating value from opportunity or also threat, both. And it also helps them to comply and standardize their operations by providing them a framework of standardization of reporting. ISO 14064 can be applied to variety of organizations, from hospitals to engineering companies, to software development companies, to textile and apparel, to shipping industry, a very wide range of industries. Almost everything comes under the purview of 14064. So, this is not exclusive. It is a standardized framework which can be applied to any organization and any industry which is wanting to report GHG emissions. So, helping them to understand what to do, what all to do when we want to report these emissions, and how to verify and validate is what will be facilitated through ISO 14064. With this, we will stop here in this particular lecture, and in tomorrow's lecture we will be talking about what to do and how to do when we want to measure and verify and report GHG emissions. So, we want to do GHG accounting. So, what to do and how to do is what we will look at in tomorrow's lecture, which will lead us to the discussion on scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions subsequently. So, thank you very much for being with me here today. See you tomorrow again for the third lecture of this week for this ongoing course. Thank you. Bye-bye.